So we're about 2 minutes after the hour, and I want to welcome everyone. My name is Kalei Kanuha, and I am the Assistant Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at the University of Washington School of Social Work. The University of Washington is settled on the original homelands of the Coast Salish peoples, place touching the shared waters of all tribes within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. We are honored to study, learn, and work for justice on behalf of the Indigenous ancestors who were first, for the many Native people traditions who thrive here today, and for the generations to come who will be sustained by the earth, waters, animals, plants, and skies of this place. From wherever you are tuning in today, please honor the first peoples of your place in the chat. And if you do not know who they are, please learn their histories and give back in gratitude. I also honor my own Hawaiian ancestors, Nakanako Uivi, o Navai Evalu, the first people from the lands of the 8 oceans. Kukia Imauna. On behalf of myself and my colleagues on the editorial board of Affilia, Feminist Inquiry and Social Work, we are excited you to the inaugural event of Affilia's Critical Feminist Social Work Roundtable series. Before we start, I will share a few announcements. First, as been longtime contributors, subscribers, and of the Affilia Journal, we hope you have heard the exciting news about our name change to Affilia Feminist Inquiry in Social Work. Please note the link in the chat to an announcement from the editorial board about the history and rationale for this name change. We are all very, very excited and looking forward to what the name will bring in terms of our continued scholarship and activism on behalf of Feminist Inquiry in Social Work. Second, we will have everyone muted during this session. So please put your comments and questions in the chat or in the Q&A. We will try to get to as many of them as possible. And in the spirit of critical thinking and respect, we ask us to consider our language, references, and ways of being together in these communications. Please mind your Zoom etiquette. Third, the November issue of Affilia is out now, and all of our panelists' articles speaking today are available open access this week. Please check them out and learn more about esteemed speakers today. And finally, you'll see in the chat an upcoming special issue of Affilia on feminist inquiry and social work. We invite everyone to share your work with abstracts are due on January 31st, and full manuscripts, I think, are due at the end of May, but just watch for that first abstract due date. And finally, I am now honored to introduce my editorial board colleague, Dr. Sarah Mounts from the University of Albany, who will be our moderator today. Sarah's research interest child welfare and juvenile justice involved youth, particularly LGBTQ youth and families, and homeless youth. Sarah engages her communities and research through feminist, qualitative, and community focused on the intersection of gender identity and sexual orientation, age, race, and ethnicity. Great pleasure and honor to welcome my new friend and colleague, Dr. Sarah Mounts. Sarah?
Thank you so much, Kalei. I'm so honored to be welcoming our 3 guests and introducing our 3 guests tonight, Dr. Reshawna Chapple, Dr. Miriam Valdovinos, and Dr. Meg Panichelli. And if I smile giddily the whole time I'm introducing them, it's because I hold such genuine fondness and respect for each one of them and their work. Dr. Reshawna Chapple is an associate professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Central Florida. Her research contributes to scholarship in the areas of critical deaf studies, critical race feminism, culturally responsive practice, and the intersections of social work praxis. Her body of work advances social justice-oriented frameworks by employing Black feminist theories, intersectionality, and qualitative methodologies. She worked as a clinical social worker in the areas of mental health, crisis intervention, education, and disabilities. She received her BSW, MSW, and Ph.D. in Justice Studies from Arizona State University. Dr. Chapple co-authored the article Exploring Intersectional Identity in Black Deaf Women, the Complexity of Lived Experience in College with B'nai Bridwell and Kashana Gray. Welcome, Dr. Chapple.
Thank you.
Dr. Miriam Valdovinos co-authored the article Intimate Partner Violence, Help Seeking for Latina Undocumented Immigrant Survivors, Feminist Intersectional Experiences, narrated through testimonio, with Sarah Nightingale and Maritza Vasquez Reyes. Dr. Valdovinos' scholarship addresses the health effects of intimate partner violence experiences in Latinx families. A primary goal of her research is to develop multi-pronged, individual, family, and community-based, culturally responsive programs that address the effects of IPV on Latinx communities while considering systemic constraints such as institutional racism and poverty. As a Xicana Indigenous scholar, social welfare scholar, she centers testimonio narrative methodologies, culture, healing, and resistance. And she wants her research to amplify the voices of marginalized women who are survivors of IPV, to understand interpersonal violence in diverse communities, and to highlight intersections of structures of oppression and social support systems. Welcome, Dr. Valdovinos. Dr. Meg Penicelli is an assistant professor in the undergraduate department of social work at Westchester University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Penicelli's teaching and research are grounded in feminist approaches to social work, namely those that incorporate anti-carceral, queer, and intersectional frameworks of oppression. In her past work experience, she managed a harm reduction program for injection drug users and people involved in sex trade, coordinated an LGBTQ domestic violence program, trained and supported advocacy staff at a domestic violence shelter, and facilitated sexual violence prevention education with K through 12th graders. Dr. Panicelli co-authored the article Using Anti-Carceral Feminism to illustrate the impact of criminalization on the lives of individuals in sex trades with Mashula Kapos-Desilas and Diana Payne. Welcome, Dr. Panicelli. I'm so honored to be in conversation with all of you tonight, and I'm so grateful to the many folks who came and wanted to be part of our first Critical Feminist Methodology Roundtable. So we have 4 questions that our editorial board came up with, and I'm going to ask them to you sort of round robin style, starting with Dr. Chapple. So the first of our 4 questions is, how would you describe yourself as a researcher and scholar? And how do feminist methods fit into those claimed identities?
Well, thank you so much, Sarah. And I want to thank Affilia for having me here. I'm so excited about this opportunity. In thinking about myself and my identity as a scholar, I think about myself or my identity as an intersectional feminist. And these all have to do with my identities as a Black woman, as a wife, as a mother, as a daughter. And these all inform my scholarship just based on looking at myself from a Black feminist standpoint theory, and definitely from someone who is an insider, outsider in a lot of these communities. So I situate myself from a perspective of either knowing and seeing in my lived experience, or from sitting with someone to see how they are feeling about a certain subject. A lot of our research is done from the top down, and I definitely like to kind of sit with and look at research from a perspective of kind of the bottom up or a standpoint of epistemology.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chapple. I appreciate that alternative framework. Dr. Valdovinos, how would you describe yourself as a researcher and scholar, and how do feminist methods fit into those claimed identities?
Yes, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, everyone. So excited to be here with all of you. As mentioned earlier, I identify as a Xicana feminist social work scholar and educator. And part of the reason I start there is because part of this identity for me means foregrounding my cultural intuition, right? Dolores Delgado Bernal talks about this as part of our theoretical framing, right? So my pedagogy, my scholarship is informed by this cultural intuition, along with, our theory training, et cetera. So I was born and raised in Southern California, and my parents are of Mexican descent from Michoacan. And our ancestral lineage is of the Purepecha indigenous roots there in Michoacan. And so more recently, so this has been after finishing my doctoral degree and continuing to do postdoctoral, learning and understanding of the work, I started using the X in Xicana instead of the CH in the front to emphasize part of our Nahuatl language, right? A widely spoken indigenous language as part of my heritage. So that's still evolving for me, how my indigenous roots fit into all the work that I do. So it's one of those things that every day I feel like I'm learning something new of how I incorporate all this work into my my scholarship. And so with my theoretical lens, I oftentimes am situating intimate partner violence as a systemic problem that collectively affects women differently than men, particularly because of the structural inequalities and social conditions. So when I think about feminist methods, I'm oftentimes in my work, I feel like I'm challenging not only patriarchy, but as well as how that intersects with racism, sexism, nationalism, classism, et cetera. So that's a little bit about how that fits into my work. So oftentimes I am pulling from Xicana feminist work as well as indigenous feminism's work.
Thank you so much, Miriam. And Dr. Pacelli, how would you describe yourself as a researcher and scholar, and how do feminist methods fit into those claimed identities?
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you, everybody. This is so exciting to be a part of. When I was preparing for this conversation, I started in the middle, and so I was like, how do I identify? And I was just looking back at some of my notes and thinking about how I often situate myself on the first day of classes when I'm teaching, and getting that as part of giving that to students as part of who I am and how I approach our coursework. But I think that for me, in the research that I've been a part of and that I've done, and the writing that I've done, locating myself or situating myself has been so important. And I feel like from my critical feminist mentors have been pushed to position myself and be able to say, and so what? You are these identities, and how does that show up in your research? And I think that's been so critical. So some of the identities that I hold as a researcher and a scholar include being a white person, being a settler, being middle class and college educated. I'm queer. I'm able-bodied, a U.S. citizen, and a parent now, and a feminine identified person. I also have a history working in the sex industry, and because my work has revolved around sex trade and different forms of sex trade and sex work, it's been really important to me to use reflexivity and to recognize where my identities come in, where I'm counter-transferring, where I'm able to identify as an insider, outsider, how both of those show up in the work that I've done. And so I would say that I I mean, I think in our bios, you said quite a bit about like my previous work and my identities, but I think that's I'll stop there because I know it will just expand throughout our conversations.
Thank you, Meg. I'm humbly moving to first name basis. Hope that's okay. Reshawna, how did you come to encounter feminist methods within or outside of social work and to develop the skills to employ feminist methods in the ways that you have in your work?
Well, I was looking at this question and it feels like an extension of kind of the identity question. So I'm going to kind of start by thinking back kind of at this lived experience idea. A lot of my work is done kind of from, like I said, the insider outsider standpoint, kind of lived experience perspective. And so my lived experience, I too was born and raised in Southern California. But I was a child of a teenage mom. And there was different points in my life in which people would kind of decide what I could or couldn't do, or what I should and shouldn't do. And I remember that my mother was determined to create an environment in which my brother and I thrived, and that we weren't limited by our circumstances. And, I don't necessarily, kind of want to come across from this position that, oh, well, because my mom wanted me to be here, I could be here. I was able to kind of take all of those experiences, but I think back to childhood and think about the fact that my mother was the oldest of 5. And so for most of my adolescence, I lived with my mother, my grandparents, and my mother's siblings. And my mother's siblings spent a great deal of time and effort telling me that I was loved and wanted and smart. And so I think about that in terms of feminism and our methods and social work. And I know that this feels a little bit more about like my identity, but it kind of weave all of that together when I'm thinking about how I came to social work. I came to social work because my first child is deaf. And it was in the mothering and the learning about education and the learning about trying to parent a deaf child. And also that thread that my mother taught me about independence and being able to take care of yourself from this womanist perspective that helped me with my social work practice, that then moved me into my role of social worker. So I think my entire lived experience and my identity, moving into social work, one of my first internships working as a social work student was working with the law school at Arizona State. And I worked with a lawyer in which we sat with survivors of violence through court cases and trials. And we worked through emotional support that way. And then I moved on to crisis intervention, social work. And so if I think about the roles as social worker and the ways in which I thought about raising my 2 children, being married, and then all of these ways in which society has kind of talked about, being the product of a teenage mom, being a Black woman, being a social worker, being these, that, and the other, it led me to kind of look at the ways in which we can tell stories, from, as I said before, a standpoint, epistemology, that really helps. And looking at, Black feminist theories, they help us to be able to, not kind of normalize or stake that everything has to be one particular way, that everyone's stories are welcome and valuable and everyone's stories need to be told. So that's where I kind of take my feminist standpoint theory, if you will, and my methods and research and kind of weave them through social work. And so within my teaching, within my practice, and also within my research, I'm weaving all of these lessons, that I learned along the way, and all of these experiences that I've taken from people who I've worked with as a social worker, people who I've taught, and people who have taught me. And so that's kind of the way in which I think about my research, and it's always intersectional, it's always inclusive, and it's always kind of learning from those experiences that we had before. Definitely kind of a grounded theory approach.
Thank you. So beautifully put. The personal is methodological, is pedagogical. Thank you. Dr. Valdovinos, how did you come to, or Miriam, how did you come to encounter feminist methods within or outside of social work and to develop the skills to employ feminist methods in the ways that you have?
Yes, thank you for the question. And, as I was thinking about this as well, like for me, my practice experience also came up as part of this conversation. One of the major reasons I pursued a doctoral degree in social work there at the University of Washington was that when I was doing my practice work, I often encountered the lack of programming or the lack of understanding and even research that would address some of the experiences that I was witnessing that folks were experiencing, right, when I was doing the work in shelters for folks that had survivors of domestic violence, or whether it was educational programs for Spanish-speaking communities. I constantly saw this connection of structural inequalities in the experiences they were having with the violence and other things going on in their lives. And so for me, a lot of my feminist training came during the time that I was in my doctoral program. I also completed a graduate certificate in the Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies department. So that really helped me expand my methodological and theoretical training to go into work that's more interdisciplinary as well. So a lot of that started as a doctoral student. And now that I reflect on that, it's interesting, right? Because I feel like my undergrad and even my master's degree kind of, I learned a lot about different ways that theories work for individuals, for communities and families, but I do think that that grounding in social justice as part of my doctoral work really helped me kind of flourish more into gender, women, and sexuality studies. I also would say that even now, as a postdoctoral or, after completing the PhD, I still find myself trying to practice this better and learn from my colleagues. So I had the great fortune of participating in the Democratizing Knowledge Project that is co-led by Dr. Chandra Mohanty and Linda Carty at Syracuse. And so that helped to learn from scholar activists, how to do this work when we're in the work, and as well as learning from Ruth Zambrana in the Intersectional Qualitative Research Methods Institute. So really trying to understand, how do I analyze my data with an intersectional lens, right? I feel like I didn't get a chance to do a lot of that. I'm still practicing how to do better through my writing and my research. And I feel like for me, I oftentimes think about this quote by Luana Ross that reminds me of some of the tensions that sometimes I see in white feminist spaces, where Dr. Luana Ross says, Indigenous feminism privileges storytelling as a way to decolonize and empower our communities. So that quote, I go back to that when I'm doing my work, when I'm looking at testimonios or narratives, to remind me of why are we doing this work? Why does it matter? And how do we envision that moving forward?
Thank you so much, Miriam. And Meg, same question. How did you come to encounter feminist methods?
Yeah, I'm trying to speak up. I got some feedback that my voice was lower than everyone else's. So hopefully someone can let me know again if I'm trailing off or not, if you can't hear me as well. But I'll go back to my practice experience as well. But I I was a women's and gender or women's studies at that time major in my undergrad. And after graduating, well, I would say it was there that I encountered intersectionality and critical feminisms, and just learned so much about what I wanted my work out in the field to look like. And at the time, I was kind of switching between majors around being a teacher or being maybe a health and phys ed teacher, or an English major, or I don't know, maybe a social worker, but I hadn't really come into my orbit yet. And I ended up teaching for a program called Philadelphia Teaching Fellows for a few months, and realized that I didn't like the person who I was in the classroom in that context. And I felt very much like I was being this white teacher who was trying to come in and rescue all the children of color that were in my classes. And then at the same time being pushed to create lesson plans that I had no idea what I was doing, and had poor boundaries around discipline and the ways that I was trying to include that in my classroom. And I realized at some point that I didn't want to tell my students what to do, but I wanted to work with them more and work with them and their families. And eventually I was led to working with a needle exchange program in Philadelphia. There we had one in Philly at that time, and then I was also doing some volunteer work with another group in Philly that was doing outreach. We were doing outreach to women identified and trans identified folks working on the street. And I hadn't really thought too much about research at that time until I started noticing a researcher hanging around our needle exchange. And it felt like, I was like, who is this person and what are they doing? And they clearly stand out, but they're just kind of like lurking around. And I was like, I don't think I like this. And so when I went into my MSW, we had to do a master's thesis. And I talked to a feminist sociologist, Lisa Hubner, at the school I was at, which is the school I teach at now, Westchester. And I said, can you tell me more about feminist research? I don't want to do things that are oppressive and exploitative and taking advantage of the people that I want to work with. And she was really amazing. And we did independent studies on feminist reflexivity and intersectionality, and figuring out how to take that and the lens that I was using in the work I was doing with drug users and sex workers, and think about how to be anti-oppressive as we were doing research. And so with Dr. Hubner and my mentor, or my research mentor at the time, Dr. Nadine Bean, we were able to kind of put some sociological feminist concepts together and social work together, and build this research project that was pretty powerful. And I ended up doing a qualitative research study with 8 folks that I had been working with in this community about their experiences navigating systems, legal systems, healthcare systems, and just kind of what their experiences were. And I mean, it's 12 years after that, and it's, I think, really powerful still. And I have lots of questions about the research that I engaged in then, and was in a lot of uncomfortable situations that really pushed me to think about what my presence meant during some difficult interactions that people were having, and how I was able to participate and navigate dual or multiple roles. And then I would say that after as I was writing my thesis, I encountered Stephanie Wahab's work, and found that she was one of few social work scholars that I could find doing research that was rooted in critical feminisms and valuing sex worker voices and listening and saying, hey, social workers, we need to listen to the people that we work with. This is how we can do better research. And so, I decided I had to work with her and went to Portland State, and feel really grateful about the work I ended up doing under her guidance and mentorship, as well as many other folks.
Thank you so much, Meg. Isn't it funny how when it comes to research, sometimes social workers need to be reminded again to listen?
Well, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so Reshawna, the next question is, how does intersectionality as concept and practice inform the ways you employ feminist methods in your thinking and work?
Wow, I'm enjoying listening to everyone's kind of journey of how we all got here, and then thinking about intersectionality. I think it informs everything. It seems to have been this way of thinking and looking at things that even today I'm teaching a diversity for social work course to grad students. And whenever I start talking about intersectionality, not necessarily as a concept, but as a way of looking at people's identity, the way of understanding their lived experiences, the person in their environment and who they are, the way in which we situate everything, it becomes just amazingly helpful and clear in doing practice and research, because we're also multi-layered and multifaceted. But I want to speak just a little bit about how specifically on the work that I'm doing, I use it to inform. This article that I'm highlighting today was actually a part of my dissertation, and I finished in 2012. So I feel like it's something that has really stood the test of time. And this is actually the second article based on this dissertation that I published with Affilia. I published the actual, the theoretical framework a couple of years ago. And so in my dissertation is on Black deaf women, and basically Black deaf women pursuing higher education. And I obviously was interested in this because at the time I was finishing my dissertation, my daughter, who's deaf, was looking at career, college. She was getting ready to graduate from high school. And I remember there was so many things that we had to kind of try to consider. This is a Black woman, this is, a deaf person. So safety, race, gender discrimination, all of these things kept kind of coming to the forefront. And as I was trying to help her to figure out the best place to go to school, we actually, I ended up doing all of this research that ended up becoming my dissertation. And so when we're thinking about kind of the question sometimes that we have, sometimes our own personal lived experience can kind of run through our threads as we're talking about as social workers. So when I first got into my PhD program, I did not necessarily want to study deaf women or Black deaf women, but I remember the chair of my dissertation, Dr. Mary Romero, who's a sociologist. My dissertation, my PhD program was in social justice, and it was interdisciplinary. So my chair was a sociologist. So I got to look at things from this sociological social work lens, which was amazing. She basically talked a lot about taking the knowledge that I'd already gained from my research, and to be able, my research on trying to help my daughter find the best school, and then look at, how I could weave that into my practice. So, you know, long story short, as I started actually trying to think about ways in which I thought about identity and I thought about Black deaf women, I thought about some of the struggles and the issues and also the strengths, and having a daughter who excelled in school, who a lot of the challenges that she went through had to do with people saying what she could and could not do. I started trying to understand situational identity, and I started trying to understand a way in which to look at intersectionality that wasn't just two-pronged. Because sometimes when we read a lot of the articles, we look at articles that talk about, you know, gender and race, and maybe, you know, usually two facets, sometimes three, of the identity. And I was really, really interested in understanding not only at least three facets, gender, race, and disability, but then also I was interested in understanding how institutional spaces would fit within those. And so that was kind of how this concept, and looking at it from this, like I said, this feminist standpoint lens and this lived experience weaved through intersectionality for me. So it looks like we have lost Sarah in our webinar. So I am done answering my question, and I feel like I want to ad-lib a little bit, but I think that Sarah would probably love for us to go to you, Miriam, to answer that question until we can get Sarah back.
Thanks. This is Clay. I didn't know if maybe she just got shy and decided to step off of the main platform, but thank you so much, Reshawna. So let's, I mean, we can also skip around. Meg, if you want to go next, and then Miriam, however you want to do it. But Miriam, if you're ready, why don't you go ahead? Thanks.
I can go. Sounds good. Awesome. When I was thinking about this question, one of the first quotes that came to mind was Audre Lorde's quote, "There's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we don't live single issue lives." So I feel like the work, how I incorporate intersectionality and how it informs my work, my method, my feminist methods, is starting at that place of looking at these struggles and looking at the social context and how it reflects power, privilege, and oppression. So in my work, when I'm looking at structures of power as they interconnect with social identity, so again, looking at Kimberly Crenshaw's work is part of what informs this for me. I really want to be able to understand issues of racism, classism, sexism, and nativism, especially when I'm working with communities that identify as undocumented immigrants, or someone in their family is an undocumented immigrant. And so for me, a lot of this means, you know, being able to look at these multiple systems of domination, and then also how that affects access to power and privilege, how it influences our social relationships, how it shapes our everyday experiences. So thinking about the question broadly, I do think that intersectionality interweaves with how I talk about positionality and reflexivity in my work, as well as how I leverage privilege and power. And this again could be privilege and power that either I hold as a scholar or as a researcher, as well as privilege and power for communities that I'm working with. And I'll share a little bit more specific when I talk about my recent article in Affilia. And then the last piece I would say is, and this is where I'm still learning how to do this better, is in weaving the narrative, right? The analysis and how I present the analysis as a qualitative researcher. And so again, I will share some, like a specific example when I talk about my article in a little bit. I'll pass it on to Meg.
Thank you. There's so much to say about all of these questions. So I guess I've been thinking throughout our conversation so far about what you said, Dr. Valdovinos, in the beginning, and you just said it again, that like you're still learning to do intersectionality better. and Dr. Chapple, how you said that intersectionality informs everything. And that's always been kind of my hope and my approach to practice, research, scholarship, and teaching. I would say that, where do I want to start? In my dissertation, one of the main question that I was looking at was, what are social work teachers, or what are social work instructors teaching about sex trade in their courses? And so whether that was about sex trafficking, sex work, some aspect of some sex trade, like specific sex trade. And I wanted to kind of get a sense of like what kind of literature and content they were utilizing and teaching future social workers. And kind of the literature and the activist literature and scholarship I'd been like immersed in for the last many years, I think really overlapped with intimate partner violence, and I've always been really like influenced by the work of Insight and just many activists involved in reproductive justice and domestic violence movements and sex worker rights movements. So I wanted to think about how this dynamic where there are these interventions that are aimed at rescuing people who seem young or seem like they're victims of sex trafficking, and what the outcomes would be after police or law enforcement raids. And so what had been coming up was recognizing the ways that young Black girls, young Black women, Black trans women had been arrested in these targeted stings or these raids. And the whole, point was to rescue, and I'm putting that in quotes, people from harm. And so I think for me, part of my interest in studying sex work and sex trade, and then also social work education and how we employ intersectionality in our teaching or our research, is also to think about how we build relationships or don't build relationships with law enforcement, and then contribute to the overwhelming number of Black and Brown folks in prisons. And so, I think that I was asking questions about, for my analysis, asking more questions that were like, where do race, class, gender, ableism, migration status, citizenship status, age intersect, and how are these dynamics apparent in our, many systems that social workers work with. I know that we use intersectional. I know that in social work, I hear intersectionality a lot. And so I think that's different than when we talk about the intersections of oppression. And I am interested in aspiring, I guess, to make sure that I'm using this critical lens, this intersectional lens to think about data, to think about the experiences I'm engaging with, and putting out thought from sharing knowledge from the folks I work with, and then according to the various types of feminisms that I'm using for analysis as well.
Thank you, Meg. There must be some stormy weather in Albany that I'm not aware of because I've been in the building all day. I apologize for slipping away, but I'm back. So it looks like we're on to the second substantive question. So Reshawna, can you specifically discuss your Affilia article and how you approached that project using feminist methods? And what was feminist about the research or analytical methods you used?
Okay, welcome back. Wow, this is just amazing listening to these two brilliant scholars talk about their work and how they came about everything. And it's making me think about my work kind of over and over again and in terms of the way, you know, we got here. And so I think a lot of times too, particularly maybe, I feel like I'm losing time with the pandemic and everything. But I was promoted to associate professor in 2020. And I think about, my doctoral students now, I'm constantly kind of telling them to, love your dissertation because, this is something that is going to be with you. And I feel like I had to put my dissertation aside to kind of earn tenure, to do kind of the work that people expected me to do so that I can then come back to like really doing the work that I love now. And so in thinking about my article and thinking about feminism and intersectionality kind of broadly defined, I think about the fact that I'm still learning kind of, learning about the work. It's amazing to me when I go back and read what I've written and read, the research. I'm like, wow, I wrote that. And I don't really remember writing it, or I don't know kind of how I came about that. But the more time passes, the more it's easier, or the more we kind of can reflect back on what we did. So, I mentioned earlier that this is, basically a chapter from my dissertation. And so this data was collected back 10 years ago. But I feel like it is so incredibly relevant in the way in which we can look at intersectionality. And so this was really based on my first question, which was how do Black deaf women understand their intersecting identity? I just really wanted to understand from this point of view, and particularly being a mom who was raising, a Black deaf woman, how can this person understand herself or themselves enough to be able to be an independent person? My main point was just to make sure that all of those looks that we would get, all of that, I feel so sorry for your child that can't hear, was turned into this empowerment place. And so I started from this perspective that was, which one of these identities is the most problematic for Black deaf women, is what I kept saying. And I was very, very fortunate to have a professor in social work. She was with me in my bachelor's, my master's, and she also sat on my PhD committee. She passed away a few years ago, but she was just this great feminist scholar. Her name is Nora Augustison. She would always kind of say to us when we were working with populations to make sure that you meet the people where they are. This is what we say about social work, but she was very, very poignant in saying that you need to understand that you are seeing people in normally sometimes their worst place, and you have to find the strengths in them, and you have to understand that people are complex. They are not just simple beings. So, look at them for everything that they have. So the whole time I'm trying to ask all of these women, what is the worst thing? Is it being deaf? Is it being Black? Is it being a woman? And some of them were queer, and some of them, came from, poverty. And what is this? And I kept trying to separate their identity throughout all of it, even while I was asking them, how did they understand their intersecting identity? So if I kind of can come back and explain this without being too winded, I apologize. I'm getting excited about it, talking about it. The more I talked to the women, the more I understood that identity is situational and it moves. And so in sign language, the sign for intersectionality kind of looks like a cog that moves around. And what I found out in talking to women is, depending on the situation, an identity would kind of flip to the top. There is a woman, oh my gosh, her last name is Mitchell. She's also a Black deaf woman. She wrote an article called Flashcard. And she said, my identity is a flashcard. And so she talks about how it flashes. And so when I'm thinking about identity and I'm thinking about this article, I'm thinking about every single woman that I talk to, depending on the situation and depending on what was going on, they would kind of flash it. And so as I was getting this data and as I was listening to the questions, I would say, okay, what is it like being, a Black deaf woman on a campus that is predominantly male and predominantly hearing? Or what is the worst thing? I kept coming at it from this, unfortunately, this deficit perspective until my professor was like, no, strengths. But I would ask them that. And so, one would say, well, it's really hard to be, Black, and would talk about being Black, and then say, but then it's really hard to be the only person in your class who needs an interpreter. So it's hard to be deaf. And it just kept moving like a dial. And it wasn't until I was able to kind of sit back and say, okay, in order for people to understand what it's like to be a Black deaf woman on a college campus, I definitely need to break down the identities. I need to break down what racism looks like, what sexism looks like, what ableism and autism look like in terms of deaf community, all of those things, and what the voice is coming from this individual. But then at the same time, I need to help them understand how you cannot separate any part of your identity at any time. And so you have to look at the being as one individual. I'm calling people beings, but you know what I mean. So we think about a person as a whole person. And so if we think about our research, and if we think about also our practice and our scholarship in general, we approach it from this perspective in which we're almost pulling people apart, saying, okay, this is what's going on with them, and this is what I need to focus on. But we also cannot leave any of the identities behind. So the thing that I think I learned the most, and what I feel is the most feminist about my article and, intersectionality, in its space, is the way in which, standpoint epistemologies, the way in which Black feminist methods are inclusive. And we tend to not ever leave any part of a person behind. So whatever that is. And so when I'm thinking about my practice, when I'm thinking about all of these things, I'm constantly trying to almost take apart my people and then kind of put them back together so that I can understand and explain the pieces that people don't always understand, particularly if you're looking at someone and you're making an assumption based on what you see or what you learn about them very briefly.
Thank you. That was so powerful. I'm glad I made it back for it. And that very much came through in the 3 words that you asked your co-researchers participants to provide in the article. They were many of them were very celebratory and strength-based. Miriam, can you discuss your Affilia article, how you approached the project using feminist methods, and what was feminist about the research or analytical methods you used?
Yes. What an amazing panel. I feel just giddy learning all the, just having this conversation together. I feel so privileged to be here. So for my article, it's also a part of my dissertation. And in the paper that was published in Affilia, I was trying to highlight the testimonio narratives that the women survivors shared in regards to how institutional barriers continue to exclude undocumented immigrant IPV survivors, intimate partner violence survivors, and their children when they were trying to seek help. And I am grateful that my dissertation chair, Dr. Tessa Evans Campbell, guided me through a lot of this work along with my dissertation committee, because initially as a project, it's a qualitative project where I was going to be interviewing the survivors, but I didn't necessarily know what I was going to be interviewing them about. I had been building or working with building community relationships there in Seattle as a doctoral student. And It took me 7 years to finish my PhD program, and part of it was that, I was trying to be more intentional of building that community relationship and trust to be able to talk about topics that can be considered sensitive in some of our communities. And so initially I thought I was going to do a phenomenology study, more traditional qualitative work. And as I was engaging with the women, it came across very clear that if they were going to participate, they wanted to make sure that this project was going to be meaningful for them too. And so as we were talking about, just thinking about what questions potentially would guide this research, I was also learning about testimonio as a method, right? When we think about the method coming from Latin American studies with roots in liberation struggles in Latin America. So this kind of, kept coming up, and I was like, okay, can we do something like this, right? And so in collaboration, talking with some of the key informants and just, working with the community, that felt like it fit better with the goals of the project. So when we think about testimonial narratives, the intent is political, right? It aims to give voice to oppressed people, or people that are experiencing oppression. And that was very clear when I was just conceptualizing my study, that was going to be more meaningful if I took that approach with the folks that I wanted to interview. So as part of the methodology, it's also part of critical race methodology stance when we think about Dolores Delgado Bernal's work, Lindsay Perez-Uber. And so this methodology helps, it's seen as a tool for building a solidarity discourse. Oftentimes the work that's done using testimonio is looking at victims of state terrorism or other forms of injustices. So when I think about testimonio as a tool for women of color, particularly Latina women in this study, we were trying to theorize oppression, but also resistance and subjectivity of their experience. And so that's kind of like the method of the study. And in this, I collected this data in 2013, 2014. And so again, like when we think about how publishing works and, how our work changes through time, I was really, this paper I had actually sent out in a different form, like it was not what it is now, but as an initial project, and it had been rejected from another journal. And I kept thinking like, Affilia, I wanted to publish other things in Affilia, but I was like, if I really want to center my feminist intersectional analysis, Affilia will probably be the best, just the audience of who reads Affilia, as well as the editorial board, right? And so thinking about the peer reviewers or who would read this piece and where would I get the best feedback to be able to improve my work. So when I sent it to Affilia, I was so fortunate that the feedback that I got from my peer reviewers was so helpful to make this piece better. So for those that have not read it, or, I encourage you to go check out the article, but I think one of the things I would mention is that when I first submitted this paper, it was probably twice as long, right? It's like, I didn't want to cut the narratives. I was like, oh, this is so important. But I had to be able to publish it. And one of the things that was helpful through this process was being able to know, like, if you're doing thematic analysis, that's okay, right? But if you're doing narrative analysis, how does that look different when you're presenting the data? So I'm hopeful that the way that I tried to present the data in the article makes that clear. I think, again, like when I think about the stories, I was trying to not only have the women's voices tell us about the barriers that they suffered, but also those moments of solidarity with other IPV survivors. And so again, when I weave the stories of the 6 women, the narratives that are shared in this article, I was trying to be intentional with that. And I realized, right, like now looking back, there are certain stories of joy that I ended up cutting because I wanted to make sure like the implications of like the work that we need to do better in our field were resonating. But now looking back, I'm like, I wish I could have left like a longer narrative of the story where one person would organize everyone at the transitional housing program so the kids could go ice skating or could go to the movies, and what that meant for women to build that solidarity. So hopefully there'll be a part 2 of the work, because it's just so much that richness from the narratives that I feel like one article is hard to capture it all.
Thank you so much. That's a very real tension. Like, how do I work it all in and do justice to this whole story? And I feel you on the 6 to 7 year dissertation journey, my friends. But I'm hearing this theme of like passionate dissertating, persistence with the data over time and space as we navigate, right? Like academia, and also taking cues and listening to the community and really amplifying the community and what they want to happen. So thank you for that. And Meg, can you discuss your Affilia article and how you approached that project using feminist methods? What was feminist about the research or analytical methods you used?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both. This is just a really enjoyable experience. So, and thank you, Sarah and Clay and Sam and Brooks as well. So I just want to say that first, the folks I co-authored the article with, Reshawna and Dina, they're both, they conducted the research in LA. And so I have some notes kind of from them and from our article. And then I came in kind of after they had done some of the analysis or some of the coding, and did more around the anti-carceral feminist analysis with them. But was able to read the transcripts and the interviews, and it makes me feel like really proud of them, or like inspired by the work that they did as well. Because this article stems from a larger project that they were initially working on around, or that was exploring how diverse folks in sex trades manage personal life and work and personal life in the industry. And so overall, they had approached this qualitative project by using in-depth feminist narrative interviews and life timelines. And, they really wanted to have an emphasis on the being able to really dig into the stories and allow the stories to have meaning, and have the participants really highlight that meaning with them in the interviews. And they use the life timelines to really contextualize the stories, and to also ideally have the participants that they were researching with be able to remember kind of the emotions and think about the significance of these different life events. The focus within the research, within the data collection, was really to amplify marginalized voices, and they had interviewed a total of 23 men, women, and trans folks, and some non-binary identified folks in the interview process itself. But they were looking to talk with individuals who faced oppression and stigma due to the intersections of gender and sexuality and sex work, and really encourage participants to be active in the meaning making. And, I think, like, talking about the personal being the political, the narratives were especially useful for identifying, for the research participants themselves, identifying their their own experiences as folks who had experienced stigma and denigration and been pathologized when interacting with various systems. So I get excited rereading the article. I think during the publication process, I felt like it took a long time to get it published, which was due to amazing feedback from Affilia. And but it's really exciting to look back now and notice these pieces. So what happened was, when they were doing this larger research project, they recognized that there were that their research team had come up with 2 themes that were important and that they kept occurring and wanted to shed more light on, which was around every one of the participants had experienced interactions with law enforcement during raids or stings, and had their lives significantly impacted because of those interactions. I want to make sure I get this part right. Okay, so, sorry. Okay. Yeah, so, I mean, I think that the narrative piece of the research is what made the research and the findings so powerful, and to see the ways that, due to the influence of, or the intervening of law enforcement, the ways that folks lost a lot in their lives and experienced deep trauma and mental health issues, along with a number of other concerns. And I'll talk about that in just one second. So they overall kind of what we framed our findings through these two themes of police raids and stings, and then effective incarceration on the lives of sex trade workers. And so what we noticed was that folks in the study had traumatic experiences of police arrest. Police were deceptive during the sting, and then there was the use of police squad intimidation during the raid, which made things really terrifying. And then the effects of criminalization on the lives of folks in the sex trades were severe for the folks in the study, and included but weren't limited to living in fear, being hypervigilant, navigating tumultuous relationships in personal and professional lives, troubles finding and holding alternative forms of employment, which is, so often social workers or social service workers might suggest getting out of the sex trade or sex industry. Many folks had lost custody of children and had disruption in educational aspirations, lost personal belongings and housing, experienced financial burdens, and had to engage in mandatory prostitution diversion. And so, that was just a lot of loss and really sad, traumatic things that happened for the participants in our study. And I think it's just something that we really wanted to be able to amplify, because the study was of 23 people. There was a range of identities and experiences involved in the sex trades. And so people were in different trades, had different gender identities, racial identities, ability status, documentation status, or authorization status. Yeah, so I think I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Meg. So I'm seeing that we have a couple of questions in the chat, and please feel free to continue adding your questions, but I'm going to go through the two that we have so far. I appreciate this first one having just come from teaching human behavior in the social environment before moderating this panel, and I think some of my students are here, so they might appreciate it too. I'm searching for knowledge sources for human development across the lifespan that are non-white, non-Western, and gender equality. How do you propose we collectively build such knowledge as feminist scholars and educators? Ooh, that's a good question for anyone who teaches HIBC. Does anyone want to respond to that?
I was actually going to answer question 2 because it was posed to me.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but I just have a couple of ideas. And I think that this is what a lot of us do in terms of trying to be more inclusive in our teaching and looking through building these types of things. I remember in my PhD program, one of my colleagues, you know, and this has been around, I'm sure, before then, but one of my colleagues would always say, you know, if we have any type of theory or any type of reading, let's try to find, you know, a person of color, you know, someone global, someone, you know, someone else who is doing this work that's not necessarily the person that we're always pointing to. And no disrespect from, you know, to these authors that a lot of times have these pivotal pioneering this scholarship, but we know that, you know, white voices, male voices, a lot of these voices are amplified over, you know, folks of color in general and some of the other individuals. And so the way in which I've been able to kind of build my stuff is to just really look at the themes and try to intentionally find someone else who may be doing that same kind of work, and then include them both. And it's funny when I'm working with students in writing, you know, a lot of times they'll say, well, you know, we absolutely have to use Foucault, or we absolutely have to use this theorist, you know, Brofenbrenner, because this is the one who is doing this work. And I say, you know, we don't have to use it per se. Basically, what I tell them is find someone else who's saying it, and definitely give your cred to, you know, the actual pivotal scholar. But let's look for someone else whose voice might not be out there as much, and talk about how they said it, and then also talk about how the other person said it. So that's just my 2 cents there.
Just as a follow-up, I'm curious, have you abandoned the textbook? And do you teach HIBC?
I do not. I do not. I have before, but no.
Yeah. Meg, I see you unmuting yourself.
Well, it was maybe more of a question towards you, Sarah, or like maybe some other folks who might be on this webinar, but and also Reshawna. But I had just heard at some point in the last 10 years that there were some folks working on like a critical feminist oriented human behavior in the social environment or human development type textbook.
There was some talk of that, yeah. And maybe this is a call to embrace that work. I think some of the folks in that conversation are on this call, so we hear you. Any other responses?
I think I would just add, and I haven't taught HBSC in a few years, but when I have it, like, I kind of take that approach also that Reshawna was mentioning, right? And like infusing it throughout versus like that one session, you know, because I remember, right? It's like there was that one session class that tried to capture all this diversity.
Yeah.
Really trying to be more mindful of infusing different readings. When I taught the class, I won't use a textbook. I'll use a chapter here and there of text, but it's mostly articles. I've also the approach of having a novel that goes along with the class, just to be able to illustrate the points for students with like a story that we're following along, or, and I kind of switch the novel or the book depending on where I'm teaching, what is the level, etc.
Yeah, I would say that I think that it's a constant fluid dialogue in which you are trying to, stay present and getting the most up-to-date information, and continuing to point to those pivotal articles or, chapters that you can't necessarily get rid of, but making sure that you are continuing to highlight, new individuals who are saying that same thing.
And I would, sorry, I think that was mine. I would just add that, just kind of to support what both of you or all of you are saying is like pairing articles, if you're talking about like life stages or you're talking about these historical texts that are rooted in whiteness, is also including our like critical feminist literatures, right? And using those to think through the material that we have. And I've learned a lot from folks at Portland State teaching courses on the HIBC courses or the human development and how to integrate like a theoretical perspective in addition to like I guess practical or developmental or other developmental theories.
Thanks all. These are some good strategies, but yeah, we need to keep working on it. There's 2 additional questions. So this one, Dr. Chapple, I'm struck by Dr. Chapple's comment about putting aside the work that was meaningful, in parentheses, your dissertation, to do what you needed for tenure and then coming back to that work post-tenure. I would love to hear about these tensions and strategies to address them, as would I.
Wow, Laura, thank you so much for that question. I do a lot now of mentoring assistant professors, particularly assistant professors of color and first generation, to just get this coveted, prize of tenure or try to work your way through. Coming in to my university I'm at now, it's my second university. I started off at a small place in Boston that was much more teaching focused than I wanted, and then I ended up going to the University of Central Florida. The University of Central Florida is an emerging R1, so we are doing lots and lots of scholarship and then some teaching as well. And a lot of times we'll come into a department. I came into a department, I believe, as and still the only Black individual to hold the title of professor, on any level. And so when I was looking for collaborators or ways in which to get my publishing done, I came in and it was like, you have to have 10 peer-reviewed articles, you have to have this, and this. I had a couple of mentors, I shall say loosely, who continued to tell me that I would not get tenure. That was like kind of I had this one person who would always tell me, you're not gonna get tenure, you're not gonna get tenure. And it was, I think that the person was doing that to try to help me, but it was very, very frustrating. And what was frustrating about it is that I had come in from an interdisciplinary social justice PhD with a chair who was a critical sociologist. And my committee consists of a sociologist, a Black feminist theorist, a education disability scholar, and a social worker. And so I was told coming in, you don't write like a social worker. You don't write like a social worker. And people would say to me, you write like a sociologist or you write like a this. And I didn't understand what that meant, I just wanted to kind of do the work that was passionate to me, because that's what I thought social work was. I knew that I was a great practitioner. I knew that I was able to get really good interviews and really, really get, the testimonials, if you will, from the people, the narratives, they would come out. But my research didn't look like everyone else's. And so basically what happened was different opportunities would come up, like grants or different things that would put people on, and they would never choose me, except for what was really interesting is someone else might be on that grant and they would come to me to ask me to help them with something having to do with the theory or the method or whatever. They would always want to pick my brain and have me help them talk through things. So as time was going on, I would get tapped when someone wanted to finish an article, and there was something about my expertise that could help them figure that article out. And so they would kind of say, hey, do you want to work on this? And I would end up being last author, and these things would happen. And so coupled with all of the mentoring that I was getting that didn't necessarily help me out, to make it like a long story short, what I did was I said, okay, you're a social worker and your goal is to get tenure. What do you need to do? And, I looked at what I had published. I looked at some of the partnerships that I had made, and I started trying to weave through my story. Now, I intentionally or unintentionally did not publish so much on my dissertation until the end, because I was trying to be a good collaborator. I was trying to work with people. People told me I needed to apply for grants. And what I didn't do is I didn't listen to my committee, who said, you have enough data to publish for 10 years. This is what you have. I did focus groups, individual interviews, and observations of 25 Black deaf women. I still have data from everywhere, right? On resiliency, on microaggressions, on identity, on all of it. So I was set up, but when I got there, I was listening to people in my ear telling me what I needed to do. So what I did was I said, okay, you need 10 articles. Let's get those 10 articles. Let's look at the themes that are coming through. Let's look at your social work knowledge and work on your culturally responsive treatment, your access to services, your identity work, your intimate partner violence work, and let's create a story that the tenure committee will understand. And then once I got those articles published and that stuff understood, then towards the end, I said, okay, now you can actually go to your passion project. And it wasn't that I don't think I would have been able to get tenure working on that thread. The problem is that I couldn't find people to work with me on that work, because people started kind of fantasizing about it. They would read it and they say, oh my gosh, this is wonderful. But they wouldn't help me or they wouldn't critique it. I was listening to you, Miriam, when you were talking about having that article. The two articles that I published in Affilia, and believe me, we love you, Affilia, because I tried to publish one article. It was really long. It got rejected after getting a revise and resubmit because people didn't understand it. And then I finally took I took this whole idea and I broke it up, and then I published the theory, and then I published, this other piece that we're talking about now that was in terms of the identity. I'm now moving on to the resilience piece, and then I'll move on to the microaggressions. And I just basically was able to take the feedback that I got from Affilia both times. And I think I had 2 or 3 revise and resubmits, because they kept saying, okay, what are you saying? What are you talking about? What does this mean? And in the revisions, I was able to kind of go through and really pull out what it was that I was trying to say, and to really think through what it was. And so just going back to that question, the reason that I put my stuff aside is because I feel like if I would have published it early on, it would not have been what I was able to publish later. Once I was able to think about those narratives and thinking about what I had to do to give voice to the population. Because even the question I kept getting from people are, where are you going to find these women, and what's going on, right? You know, where are you going to find them? Why is their voice important? You need to ask teachers about them, or you need to ask white deaf women about them. And it was an interesting thing in which I kept getting angry, but I knew what I was doing, but I didn't know what I was doing. So I just kind of kept with that. So I'm sorry, I'm taking lots of time.
No, thank you, Reshawna. We're getting into the real talk hour of the evening. I'm taking on the other side. I appreciate it. Yeah, sometimes we have to be so strategic. We're approaching 4:30, and there's one more question, so I'm going to put it out there. As feminist scholars, how do you all think about and navigate the complexities of gender in your work without erasing either cis, and in parentheses it says particularly women of color, or trans and gender diverse folks? I'm noting that you unmuted yourself.
Well, I don't know why I unmuted myself, but I mean, I'm not totally positive I know what the question is. Or
do you want me to repeat it?
Yes, can you repeat it one more time?
I can. As feminist scholars, how do you all think about and navigate the complexities of gender in your work without erasing either cis, and it says particularly cis women of color, or trans and gender diverse folks?
Yeah, I guess I would just, I mean, I like this question a lot, and it's something I think about, and I think I know that in the work that I've done, or in the research that I've done, I think particularly like as I'm writing, it feels important to name like cis and trans women, or cis folk, or like to name this, who we're talking about. We're talking about non-binary folks, or gender expansive youth, or individuals, or just like allowing room for really gender to be expansive, and not assuming that there's one, there's an essential identity attached to women, or an essential position attached to the category of women.
Thank you.
I would love to just say intersectionality, and not to just kind of throw it out there as the answer to all of these things. But I think that it's, for me anyway, it's hard to look at gender without looking at all of the ways in which women are women. Feminism is feminism, feminist is feminist, and the ways in which we, it's all encompassing, I think.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. I could do this once a day. Sam pointed out this is very relevant to Affilia's name change, and we did have some of these conversations, which you can read about in our latest editorial, and they included the link to that. I'm going to turn now to Calais, and with so much gratitude to all of our guests.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and for such a smooth moderation. And thanks so much to our three brilliant scholars, Reshawna, Miriam, and Meg. We so appreciate your scholarship, your humility, and your intellect in terms of talking through, what critical feminism means to, and really in the context of social work. That is really what makes, I think, our work, our shared work, so important, is that we value, and we're all social workers. And I hold that up as a really important part of what makes Affilia different than other journals around feminism, a critical race theory, or other critical analyses. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Please do check out Affilia. Please submit. We welcome all of your manuscripts, all of your ideas. Reach out to us. And again, thanks for joining us. We will have the video of this panel up on our YouTube channel in a little bit. So watch for that. Thank you again. Have a safe evening, everyone. Get where you need to go safely. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.